on the topic as we have had in the past and that many of you have had before. But we still want to allow some time for some questions at the end of the presentation. And we would like you to list those questions in the chat, and we'll be moderating those. Our presentation is going to be about 40 minutes long. Usually we end these events at 1 o'clock, and we recognize that some people will have to leave then. Feel free to do so. But if you're able to stay around, we'll continue for another 10 minutes or so that we can continue to ask questions of our special guest presenter today. This is the first time that we've co-sponsored something with Citizens for the Red Desert. We're so excited to have the diverse group of folks here for today. And I especially want to welcome our very diverse crowd. And there's some special guests in the audience, including some staff from the governor's office, other state agencies, former and current BLM and local government officials. And we really appreciate your interest in joining us today. This event will be recorded because so many people have said they couldn't make it, but they want to be able to look at it later. So just be aware that this is going to be recorded. And right now, I'm going to pass it off to my co-host, Shalise Harrison, with Citizens for the Red Desert. Take it away.
Thank you, Steph, and welcome everybody. I'm Shalise. I'm the coordinator for Citizens for the Red Desert, and really excited that WAC has allowed us to use their forum to reach more people for this talk. Citizens for the Red Desert is, like Steph said, a really diverse group, and we are very much united in our love for this landscape and our desire to sustain what makes it special for the future. I've posted the website address in the chat box. I hope you can go to the website, learn about what we're doing and the different values in that landscape. There's actually a page that Todd and numerous other history buffs helped us build regarding immigrant history. And also this talk is really part of a two-part series about history. We're doing immigrant history with Todd Guenther this month, and next month we are doing Native American history with Yufna Soldier Wolf, Wes Martell, and Jason Valdez. You can all expect to receive an invite similar to this one, and I hope you all join us for that talk as well. Without further ado, I'll introduce Todd. He brings a wealth of experience through his passion for anthropology and history in Wyoming. He's lived here for almost 40 years. He's worked for the Office of Wyoming State Archaeologist. He's been a curator for South Pass City State Historic Site, which is in the northern Red Desert, and has also directed the Lander Pioneer Museum. He has been teaching at Central Wyoming College for more than 12 years and enjoys he does a lot of field work in the backcountry with his students, and we are grateful for his time today. So thank you, Todd, and I will pass it to you.
I better unmute myself, otherwise it'll be not a very interesting conversation. Do you all see the screen? The geography is destiny. Sweet. So I cannot take credit. I stole that title from my dear friend and colleague, Jackie Clancher, who teaches most of the geography courses at CWC and includes that on her email tag. But in this case, it's so perfect. People look at this scene of the Red Desert, and some people are horrified and think it's, a godforsaken wilderness. And others, like all these people in these cars that you see driving down here, this is an Oregon-California Trail Association tour that I helped guide a couple of years ago for a bunch of crazy people that are so into Western history and the whole history of the Great Migration, as we call the westward migration. And they come out here and visit and help with various research projects over the years, and have also been very deeply involved in preservation issues. And there we go. So this is the 2005 Wyoming archaeology poster that focuses on boar's tusk in the sacred landscape of the Red Desert. And we'll talk more about these various aspects of sacredness as we progress through the program. But for at least 13 or 14,000 years since the first humans have been here, the Red Desert has been not only a breadbasket, it's like a giant grocery store full of all kinds of food for people through all the seasons of the year, but also a sacred landscape in a sacred sense, not just the secular sense, but in the sacred sense to most of the cultures who have lived in this area. And my experience with the desert goes back, I first started working on archaeological projects, like big pipeline projects and things across the desert, through the desert, back in 1981. And so for decades now, been intimately involved in the history and prehistory and then ecology of the desert as an archaeologist, but also having lived up there at South Pass for years and covered much of the desert on horseback. And then for 17 years, I also covered wagon tours, living history expeditions in the desert and on the Oregon Trail for the National Geographic Society and the U.S. Department of Education. And these were college credit courses where we took people out and really made them suffer the way you're supposed to suffer in the desert, just like John the Baptist. So I've spent a lot of nights out there, sleeping under the stars or in a tent, and a lot of days out there, summer, fall, winter, and spring. And I love that place. And we could talk about the statistics of the Great Migration, you know, the whole immigrant trail. A lot of numbers, but I think you would all be miserable and I would be miserable. So I'd rather just stick with some stories. And since we're talking about visions for the Red Desert, for the Wyoming Outdoor Council and Citizens for the Red Desert, let's just go back a little ways and talk about the immigrant vision, the Great Migration. Their vision for the Red Desert had to do with the future of their families and the future of the whole country. And you need to remember a couple of statistics. People in the old days had a lot of kids. In fact, the guy in the middle of the back row there with the mustache is my great-grandfather with most of his daughters. And the first big wagon train that came out west was in 1843, and there were 120 wagons there, about 1,000 people, and over 600 of them were kids. So right off the bat, you need, when we're talking about the Great Migration and wagon trains and pioneers, don't be thinking about John Wayne, because he has nothing to do with reality at all. The reality of the migration of the wagon trains was kids everywhere. And this family photo is just one example of that. What we're going to talk about today is the meaning of place. And you know, there have been books written about the West of the Imagination and public television TV series about the West of the Imagination. And right now, WAC and the Citizens for the Red Desert are involved in a similar mission. You know, what is the imagination? What does the West, what does the Red Desert mean to people? What is our vision? And you need to understand that the vision of the Red Desert is an ancient concept. Visions and the desert go back thousands of years. But in terms of what the CFRD is doing right now, I've been following along on all of Shayla's emails and things, and I love this. It's great because everybody is just almost universally, we love the Red Desert. There's so much loving of the Red Desert going on that it started to remind me of Tom Bell's funeral, which is kind of a weird association to make. I had the good fortune to work with one of my best friends of my entire life for 10 years. Day in and day out, 5, 6, 7 days a week. And it was interesting at Tom's funeral because everybody there was talking about what a great guy he was and how kind he was and what a gentle spirit and everything else. And having had that close association with Tom for decades and then a daily association for 10 years, you know, I also thought, I've seen this guy so mad that he was literally spitting nails almost on a daily basis. And that is how he became such a positive, motivating figure in the Western United States. The environmental movement started WAC, started the High Country News and everything else that he did. And like that, we all love the Red Desert and we all love Tom, even though he had that angry side. Most people don't love the Red Desert. Well, we're all loving the Red desert, most people hate it. They pray for deliverance as they're driving across Wyoming on I-80 and think, what a butt ugly, godforsaken place. Please get us out of here. And, you know, when I was in college in Laramie in the 70s and 80s, the federal government treated Wyoming, and people referred to it as a national sacrifice area because it is so ugly that you can't even drive through fast enough. And who cares? You know, we'll dig up the whole place to beat the Russians if that's what it takes. Some of you will recall this. And so there are, you know, just like people have different opinions about Tom Bell, people also had different opinions about the Red Desert. Most of the pioneers that crossed the northern side of the Red Desert, coming up the Sweetwater on the south side of the Sweetwater, and then over South Pass and on out into the Green River drainage, they regarded the desert as a terrible obstacle, hot and dry and dusty and all the manure in the air and just something like people on the interstate highway to get through as fast as they possibly could to move on to greener pastures, to get out west to Oregon. And this is something that my field schools over the years have spent a lot of time documenting. If you look in the background in the upper right-hand corner of this photo, you'll see a trail winding down the hillside down to cross the creek. That's the Oregon Trail. That's the Seminole Cutoff. It's also called the California Trail and the Mormon Trail, and the Army used it. All of these trails that have different names are actually the same trail. And where the students are excavating here right now is in an area that's a very large pioneer cemetery. Part of the reason people feared this trail and feared the desert is a lot of them died on the trip during the journey. And what we're doing here is excavating, trying to document in projects that we do for the BLM where these graves are located. And we know there are at least a dozen graves right here in this area of pioneers. And this caused something that the pioneers called seeing the elephant. This is back in the days before television. It's back in the days before movies or YouTube. And everybody had read about elephants in the Bible. It's an animal the size of a house with long teeth that stick out 10 feet in front of it and a nose that's like a big club. And so when people got so scared that they couldn't keep going west on the trail, the expression was they saw the elephant. They turned around and went back. And it even made it into some of the artwork like this, where one guy on his way to California just gave up. And you'll notice back behind him, down on the ground, there's a human skeleton. People were afraid on this journey. And I will confess that, you know, in those 17 years of guiding wagon trips and bringing teachers from all over Europe and Japan and the United States out here on the trail for continuing education, that sometimes we made the experience a little more exciting than it really was, just so that they would have a little more of a thrill to take home with them. And well, sometimes actually we're scared to death that they were going to drown and die. Never happened, but they felt like they were getting the full Western experience. But the more real aspect of that was not, you know, fording the stream, fording the Sweetwater with, you know, the water coming up through the floor of the wagon box. It was mile after mile after mile, day after day on the desert stretches of the trail. Sometimes we were in the Sweetwater Canyon where there were trees and topography and it was beautiful. And other stretches, in fact, this particular day is a 17-mile day. And I saw Helliers log on. They know where this is. They've been out there 1,000 times too. And this is a place that really gave people a feeling for what it meant to be a pioneer, to be on the trail, to understand and really start feeling what the desert is all about. It's intimidating for people that aren't used to it. There's too much wide open spaces. And one day we stopped for lunch on a big high hill up here where you can see the mountains in the distance and miles and miles and miles of featureless desert terrain in every direction. And, you know, these are people from back east and the cities and Europe and Japan and places like that. And the wagon stopped and everybody got their food out. And then on this one particular day, there was a guy there who was about 6'4", 250 pounds. And while everybody was standing around eating, he started to shake and perspire profusely. And finally got right in our face and said, "How do you people know where you're going? There aren't any signs out here. There are no road markers. We could get lost and we could all die." And he was so terrified. You know, we tried to point out, well, there are the mountains. That's Northwest. There's Oregon Buttes. The Sweetwater's right down there. Atlantic City and the Merck are just over the hill. But he was so terrified, he saw the elephant. and we had to pull off one of the crews in a truck and load up all of his gear and send him back down to Riverton to the airport and put him on a plane back to Chicago, where, you know, when I go to Chicago, I make sure to get there at 2 a.m. and drive through without stopping because it scares the heck out of me. But he feels safer with all the traffic and the gang wars and the drive-by shootings and everything else. And he does, because he's scared of sagebrush. He's scared of space, of wide open spaces. And that's the kind of feeling that a lot of the pioneers had, but they couldn't go back. They had to keep going. And what you're looking at here is the upper left-hand corner is Tom Bell and a couple friends of his reburying one of the pioneer women, Sarah Thomas, who died out there on that Seminole Trail in 1854 and was buried right beside the trail. And she has been dug up by looters, by grave robbers that I know of 3 times, by people looking for wedding rings and bags of gold and pocket watches and who knows what else. And back in, I think this was 67 or 68, Tom and some buddies of his were driving out there through the desert and found her bones, again, were scattered all over the place, and they reburied her. So as part of what we do for our field schools, whenever we're out in that area, we always stop and check on Sarah Thomas now. And some of you may know Bob Trebelcock. He was with the Wyoming Game and Fish for years and years. He's even older than I am. I was out here horseback one year in a blizzard. Visibility was about 50, 60 yards. And I was trying to get back to camp with some dudes and saw this guy by Sarah Thomas's grave with a metal detector. Couldn't tell who he was. He was all bundled up. And I thought he was looting Sarah Thomas, digging her up again. And went charging up there. I was going to run over him with my horse. I got so mad, and it turns out it was Bob Trebelcock. And he was already mad because he had 3 great big bull elk that somebody had poached right there. And he was using his metal detector not to find, you know, Sarah Thomas's golden fillings, but rifle bullet fragments and cartridges and things like that he could use as evidence. And so there's a lot that goes on out here in the desert, a lot of things that are legal or illegal, that are respectful or disrespectful, and people are involved in all kinds of different ways with all of this. And in total, out of the 500,000 people, there's another statistic, sorry, but out of the 500,000 people who made the journey over South Pass in covered wagons between 1843, that first big wagon train, and the last wagon train was in 1912. So they didn't stop coming along with wagons when the railroad was built or when the Civil War was over. People kept traveling west in wagon trains. The last documented wagon train that we have was 1912. And out of those 500,000 people, about 50,000 of them died. And there was no alternative. People just had to bury them where they fell, bury them in camp, and then load the kids back up in the wagon and keep on going. But the other side of that story is that there are other people who lived in the desert, for probably 13, 14,000 years. And like I said earlier, regarded it as a giant Safeway store with plenty of food in every direction in every season of the year, that thrived out there, that thought of the entire desert as home, not as a hostile, barren environment, but as a wonderful place to live. And many tribes over thousands of years worked through there. Some of the physical evidence, some of the archaeological evidence of their presence is, again, where we get into this dichotomy between, you know, a sacred area and a secular sacred area. What you're looking at here has nothing to do with food. This is a very small, it looks like a stone circle, like a tiny little teepee ring, but it's actually a fasting site. What a lot of people call a vision quest circle, or fasting site, where young men would go out and sit out here and fast and not drink or eat or sleep for several days at a time until they had a vision, until an animal or a spirit or someone came and spoke to them and gave them guidance and advice on how they would live the rest of their lives. And we've found during archaeological work out here a vast network of these fasting sites all across the desert. Some of them create like giant medicine wheel structures that are 6 miles across. They're huge. And these speak to a prehistoric vision for the desert, where this was a place where people came to pray and to worship and to think about the future, their future as an individual, their future for their people, and the future of the world and life on the planet. And so this is another type of vision for the desert, literally a vision for the desert. And people from all tribes, some of those fasting sites appear to be at least 3,000 or 4,000 years old. This is a photo of a young Arapaho man and a young Shoshone man. We know that all the tribes in this area went out there, and all the young men, or many of the young men, fasted and got their visions in the desert. So that first picture of the boar's tusk, where the Archaeology Month poster calls it a sacred landscape, is very much true, very accurate. And it's also a sacred landscape in a secular sense for the development of the United States. This is Thomas Jefferson. And, he made the Louisiana Purchase. Before he bought the state of, or the entire Louisiana territory from France, never mind the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of Indians of a variety of different tribes living out there already. The United States was a pretty much of a rinky-dink little Mickey Mouse little backwater. All we had was farm country. People produced enough food for themselves, for their family, and that was about it. Until Alexander Hamilton developed the banking and credit system that we depend upon today, the United States was never going to amount to much because we didn't produce anything that the rest of the world needed or wanted. And when Jefferson purchased Louisiana, which went all the way from the Mississippi River to the Continental Divide up here on the winds, you look out your window now, many of us, and you can see the border of Louisiana territory. And the problem was he didn't know how to make that important. And his instructions to Lewis and Clark, pictured here, were to find a practical trade route with the Pacific. And this was an extension of Marco Polo's dream of finding a trade route with China, of Francis Drake and Henry Hudson and Columbus and all the other explorers that were trying to find a trade route, a communication route between Europe and China and Japan, where the money was, all the spices, all the tea, the porcelain, the silks, and everything else that people wanted to trade and make vast fortunes. These guys were lucky that Sacagawea came along and showed them the way. They would have died without her. And the problem was that even though she got them all the way to the Pacific and back, it was not a practical trade route. Going up those rivers and hiking over the mountains of Montana and Idaho, it didn't work. It would not work for large groups of people. And as a result, this is the photo from Argentina. And people in Europe and people with power and wealth in the United States, the little East Coast colonial United States, thought that Argentina would be a wealthier, more powerful, more important nation than the United States. They had hundreds of years of Spanish development, of colonialism, and people really did not expect the United States to amount to very much at all. And so Jefferson, in his imagination, walked our skyline. There's Gannett Peak in this photo. This is looking up the Dinwiddie Valley from one of the archaeological sites that my field school's been working on up there. Excuse me. And so that's the Continental Divide on the horizon. And Jefferson walked along the crest in his imagination. He had visions of walking along the crest of what he called the Shining Mountains, because it was a little ice age and they were covered with snow and ice. And he needed a way over the mountains. He didn't get it. He died before that happened. But what you're looking at here, and for those of you that have been out in the desert, you've seen this on South Pass, this stone marker. Narcissa Whitman, Eliza Spaulding, first white women to cross this pass, July 4th, 1836. And it was put up by the old man there on the left, who was a Lander and South Pass City politician and businessman and historian. And when you first read that marker, that looks like one of the most racist statements that's ever been made. But it wasn't. That man, Captain Nickerson, that was his military title, was a close personal friend with this man here, the Arapaho Chief Friday. And these women on the right are his family, wives, daughters, kids. And Nickerson and Friday were good friends. They stayed in each other's homes, teepees and cabins. They socialized together. They worked on various projects together. They regarded each other as equals and friends. Nickerson, when he made that monument, knew that these specific women had gone back and forth over South Pass, and their ancestors had gone back and forth over South Pass for thousands of years. He had something else that he was talking about. He also knew that these Shoshone and Flathead and French mixed blood women, the Leclerc and Enos family, had gone back and forth over South Pass for thousands of years, as had their ancestors. He knew that this was the reality. He knew that Euphna Soldier Wolf's ancestor, Pretty Nose, the Cheyenne woman who married Jules Seminole Lajeunesse, who grew up as a boy at the Devil's Gate trading post, Fort Seminole, that his dad ran. And we don't know if Pretty Nose went back and forth herself over the pass, but all those Seminoles, all those Lajeunesses went back and forth. That's why the trail along the south side of the Sweetwater is called the Seminole Cutoff. This is the family that pioneered that route to get back and forth between Fort Bridger, Fort Seminole, and Fort Laramie for the fur trade, for the immigration, and everything else. Nickerson knew about this long history and prehistory of the pass. And I want you to see this too. This is Euphna's father, Mark Soldier Wolf, who as an elder in the Arapaho tribe took his responsibilities as an educator very seriously, as an oral historian very seriously, and passed on the old stories and traditions that had been given to him to my students, my archaeology students, my history students, their kids and family, like you see on the right side there. Took all of this very serious. It's an important part of human experience to share our knowledge, to share what we have with the future generations, the coming generations. And that's something that's part of this whole process of landscapes and sacred landscapes and secular landscapes as well, is they all involve people. They're important because we make them important, and we have shared senses of importance of that landscape. So back to this monument. Nickerson served in the Civil War. There's his captain's uniform on the left. Here he is in his office in Lander in the 1880s. He's an old man by this time, historian, lawyer, businessman, politician. When he was in the service in the Civil War, he served with two men who became presidents of the United States. Because of his extreme intelligence, his education, the other experiences that he had, Nickerson understood the vast sweep of history. And when he made that monument, he was talking about this event right here. The first two white women to cross the pass became important, critically important in the development of the American nation, because with them, the instant they crossed the Continental Divide, the next night, the Hudson's Bay representative, the representative of the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, saw them come down the slope into the mountain men's camp and said, that's it, it's over for us. The United States just won the entire western part of the North American continent. They're taking it away from Canada and Britain, because if the Americans can get women out here now, then more women and children will follow, and it will be, just like the song says, one nation from sea to shining sea. And so this was a major event, and this is what Nickerson was referring to when he made that monument that he put there on South Pass. And this is what the title slide in this presentation is referring to, is geography is destiny, is the destiny of the United States of America, the nation that we call home, hinged on this event right here. Because when they crossed the divide, when they came up Sweetwater, when they came up that trail and then over the divide along the north edge of the Red Desert, suddenly the United States ship of state was no longer aground on the shining mountains, but like a tidal wave, people just spilled over in covered wagons within a few years, clear out to the Pacific coast in California, Oregon, Washington, hundreds of thousands of people. And so that whole area right on the other side of the divide, you know, you look over the Wind Rivers, and it used to be Mexico over there. It used to be Canada over there. And suddenly, because those two women, does my cursor work? Those two women crossed the divide right here and continued on out to the coast, the United States became a continental nation and a global power. It was discussed on the floor of the United States Senate. And people back east said, the men, you know, that ran the family back in those days said, well, if they could do it, my wife can do it. My daughters can do it. And people headed west by the hundreds of thousands and loaded up the wagons with all of the kids and what little bit they could take, mostly food, bacon and cornmeal and things like that, and headed west for a dream, with a vision for their families' enrichment and for their nation becoming powerful. And again, to get away from the John Wayne baloney, This is a painting of the trail at South Pass that was made by a fellow, William Henry Jackson, that traveled this route 4 or 5 times over the years. Up here in the upper left, you see Oregon Buttes. Here's the Wind River Mountains in the upper right, the beautiful Sweetwater, the perfect naiad of the mountains, Sir Richard Burton called her. And bumper to bumper traffic, 5, 6, 10 lanes wide in places, as far as you could see ahead till they disappeared in a cloud of dust. Not 10 or 12 wagons like in the movies. The biggest year of the migration was 1852, and 70,000 people made the trip. That's 70. 70,000 people made the trip. It's a bigger city rolling along in these wagons than anything that exists in Wyoming today. So the scale of this migration was mind-blowing, and it was only possible because of, well, look at this bleak desert route that ran up the side of the river and around the mountains and enabled people, Americans, to completely populate the continent. Jefferson thought it would take 1,000 years. Washington and Franklin and all the other founding fathers that supported this thought it would take 1,000 years, forever. It took less than 80 from the time that the Louisiana Purchase was negotiated to 1890, when the United States government declared the frontier closed because so many people had moved out west and the Western territories were now states. So the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania is famous because that was the turning point of the Civil War. That's where the North stopped losing every battle and started to win more and more frequently. The Battle of Gettysburg is often described as being responsible for preserving the nation intact with the North and South. And South Pass is what gave the nation the West. The red desert landscape that provided that easy road, that gentle incline up to the Continental Divide, is also what made the nation possible. And just like at Gettysburg, where tens of thousands of people died, sacrificed their lives and their blood for the nation, again, 50,000 immigrants on the Pioneer Trail, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, died on the way out here. It too is sanctified in blood. And people will say, well, they could have taken the other road. They could have taken the old Spanish Trail or the Gila Trail down in Arizona and got to California that way. There's not enough vegetation. There's not enough water on those southern trails. And the North Pass that Lewis and Clark used won't support the volume of migration either. The only route that exists across the Continental Divide that could support that volume of traffic so that the Americans could just go take everything they wanted from all the Indian tribes, from the Mexicans, from the British, from the Russians, from everybody else that had a claim to any Western territories, was the South Pass route. And so now up there on the Continental Divide, there's that sad, tired desert again, where I love to spend so much time. There are these 2 little stone markers that commemorate some of the most important events in all of American history. And when those 2 old men put these boulders out here, they didn't expect that people would come visit them the way we do today, because it was still horse and buggy times. And they thought, well, someday in 1,000 years, someone will find these stones and they'll know that something important happened here. But what about the vision again? This is the view from South Pass, looking down the trail towards Pacific Springs. And it's pretty bleak. It's not any more inviting really than the southern trails through Arizona. But the pioneers knew, just like my draft horses knew, that when they got over the pass and a couple miles down the trail, there's Pacific Springs with all the water and all the grass that they could possibly drink or eat in the night before they moved on. The upper left photo, that's a historic photo of the old stage station there. Some of those buildings are still there. Pacific Springs, the first stop where the water flows to the west. The first stop on the trail, you're still out in the desert, where now you're on the Oregon side of the border. The reason those buttes there are called Oregon Buttes is this used to be the boundary of the United States and the boundary of Oregon Territory. When you passed Oregon Buttes, you were in Oregon. When you got to Pacific Springs here, you were in Oregon. And so that was the understanding of geography that people had. But they weren't really thinking about the desert scenery or the grass so much. What was going through these people's minds as they went down that slope from South Pass, and now they're in Oregon, and all they have to do is go downhill to the Pacific, and then they're going to get rich and have a beautiful green farm and apple orchards and all the wonderful things. This is the image that was in their minds. Westward, the course of empire takes its way. And you see Lady Liberty there, Columbia, the goddess Columbia, with the Bible and books of law. Oh, and she's carrying a telegraph wire, stringing the telegraph as she goes, and bringing, Christianity and democracy and the industrial age and railroads and plows and farms and cities. And you see the Brooklyn Bridge there in New York in the background, and bringing the light. This is from the book of Matthew in the Bible. This is the city on the hill. People thought they were making the world a better place by chasing all the savage Indians and the darkness and the fearful desert and the fearful mountain terrain into the darkness and off into the sea, and bringing the city on the hill to the rest of the world. That's what was going through their minds. They were envisioning a rich and prosperous future. This was the dream that in this painting, Jefferson and Franklin and Adams and all of the founding fathers had, is that this would be a continental nation. They didn't think it would happen as fast as it did, but they didn't know South Pass was there until 1836, when Whitman and Spalding made the trip and made it all possible. And so the United States then regarded itself as being the center of the world. And, Europe's over here on the right, and the United States here is in the middle, because we're in the middle of everything. And China and Japan and Australia are all over here on the left, way across the ocean. And what did that all mean? What's the vision for that? Well, ask Teddy Roosevelt, who in 1906 stood on the beach at Los Angeles, probably stood in the surf got his shoes wet in the surf at Los Angeles, campaigning, wanted to be president. And he gave a great speech there on the sand that, in a nutshell, I'll paraphrase, Europe is behind us. Europe is the past. Europe is irrelevant. The future is Asia. The economic future, the political future, the future of the planet is Asia. And he was thinking China and Japan. That's why he created the Great White Fleet. All of the American battleships painted not gray, but white, to go all around the world and sail into all the ports and show everyone in the planet how powerful we are now. That our nearest neighbors to the west, from Los Angeles or Seattle or San Francisco, is Japan and China. And the reason that we are involved with them today, the reason they talk on the news every night about what's the Tokyo Stock Exchange, what's happening in Jakarta, Indonesia, is because they're our nearest neighbors. Everything that happens over there affects the price of gasoline when we stop at the gas station to fill up our cars and trucks right now today. So what's the vision? What's the meaning for that? These are some photos that one group that we took were all from Rhode Island and Connecticut. They came out, a bunch of teachers from Rhode Island and Connecticut through Rhode Island College back east. And they came out and did an extra long and difficult trip with us. They wanted to suffer, so we really let them have it. It rained, it hailed, it snowed. They walked extra long days and had everything that we could put them through without actually risking their lives happen to them. And, making progress with those wagons took a long time, because we stopped every time we got to a place where something significant happened, or where there was an important ecological topic to discuss in terms of the Red Desert environment, and just trudging along day after day after day, going from one side of the Sweetwater to the other, and then coming along through the desert. And it was interesting. On the last night, this was our campsite. And I thank Helliers again for letting us spend so many nights up there, because this is the most spectacular place I've ever seen in my life. And that's having been in many parts of the world. There's so much history embedded in this campsite. And the view is so spectacular. You can look across and see all of the Sweetwater, paradise on earth. You can see the Wind River Mountains, and the trees are there to protect you. You're wondering, why is Paul Bracken down there in the bottom left? Yale University School of Organization and Management, speaking to Congress on C-SPAN on Thursday. So Paul Bracken is not just an ordinary Yale professor of business and management. He's also an expert in Asian affairs, China, Indonesia, also in arms races, and the nuclear arms races especially. And all through the 90s and early 2000s, they would fly him from Connecticut down to Washington, D.C. a couple times a month to speak to the secretaries of defense and the assistant secretaries of defense and to Congress, because he could tell them what was happening in Asia. And so on this particular trip, when we had all of these teachers from Rhode Island and Connecticut out here, and we're camped up here on the side of Aspen Butte in this perfect place on the planet, it was a college credit undertaking. And so they had to sit around on the ground during the day while we traveled. And then you see this bottom right photo, people are sitting on benches and wagging tongues and things here while we had people lecture to them. And sometimes it was me, other times we had geographers present different kinds of programs. And what Paul Bracken did, he's a Yale professor who can actually ride a horse. He can saddle and ride his own. He was one of our wranglers on these trips. And the requirement for the wrangling job was you had to know something and you had to be able to ride a horse. Because when National Geographic first contacted me about doing these trips clear back in, I don't know, 1990, 91, 92, somewhere in there, you know, they said, we can find all these cowboys and people that can take you out on wagons and horses, but they're all a bunch of drunks and they don't know anything. And I thought, oh yeah, those are my friends you're talking about. And they said, we can find a whole bunch of historians that know Oregon Trail history, but they don't know how to do anything. They have no practical skills. And I thought, now you're still talking about my friends and you've insulted everybody I know. And then they said, do you know, because I was a curator at South Pass at the time, and they said, do you know anybody up there who could like put one of these trips together? And I thought, well, whoa, this sounds like a dangerous undertaking, but we've got horses and wagons and been doing this stuff since I was a kid. And I guess we could give it a try. And it turned out great. Like I say, we did these trips for 17 years. It was fantastic. Met all kinds of people, had adventures, very few mishaps, thank goodness, and got to be good friends with Paul Bracken. And so the last day of this Rhode Island trip, he and I were standing up here addressing everybody sitting at our feet. I felt like Socrates or Aristotle or somebody. You know, they're sitting at our feet. We're standing on the hill below them, and they're looking at us and looking across all the perfect landscape. And we segued from the old Oregon Trail history to why has the United States fought 5 wars in Asia in the last 125 years? And then we got into Teddy Roosevelt and all this political stuff and how their economy affects our economy. And we always get involved in what happens over there because of what happened here, because of the geography is destiny of South Pass, and how not only did the United States become a continental nation and a global power, but then like a tsunami, Teddy Roosevelt's great white fleet surged across the Pacific. And, you know, we entered Tokyo Bay with our battleships and threatened to blow Tokyo off the map if they didn't start trading with us. And we've had this love-hate relationship with all the Asian nations ever since. And as we were having this conversation, two of the male teachers started to cry. And we kind of stopped and looked and thought, well, what's wrong? What is going on? And one of these guys stood up and he said, you know, I was 19 years old when I got sent to Vietnam for my graduation trip. And he said, I was standing there and my best friend took a bullet through the head and his eyeballs and brains were splattered all over me. And he said, I never knew what we were doing over there. I never knew why he died. And I come out here on this trip to learn Old West history, and all of a sudden the whole world starts to make sense. And this is part of the destiny of the nation. It's part of the geography is destiny of individual people. And it's part of the vision and the importance of the Red Desert. It's where people find themselves, whether it's 3,000 years ago in a fasting site, or whether it's some guy who was in Vietnam 30 years earlier and his best friend got his head exploded by a VC bullet, or kids that are in college or high school come out here now to start to understand ecology and how the world works. The Red Desert is a dreamscape. The Red Desert is a place that's real and not real at the same time. And it's a place where, believe it or not, our future lies out here as a nation, as a species. And that's what's important about this place. And the rabbits. I like the rabbits out there and the coyotes and the antelope too. But I think I'm about out of time. It's really hard for me, as many of you know, to stop talking ever. But I've used up a couple extra minutes. Evelyn, you can quit laughing. So I'll turn the microphone back over to Steph or Shalis or whoever is in charge. I relinquish. my podium.
Wow, thank you, Todd. I'm feeling a little bit emotional. That was very powerful. There have been several questions in the chat, and I would like us to, could you answer, in your opinion, what are the boundaries of the Red Desert?
They're bigger than anybody else's. That's a question that we've been debating. You know, we can't even define South Pass, let alone define the Red Desert yet. And my boundaries are totally unrealistic. So you should not even listen to me on this at all. Because I've never been able to convince anyone. I saw Craig Bromley's in here someplace, and he and I have had this discussion many times over the last 30 years. And those BLM people in management, or you guys at WAC, you have to make that decision. I'm ducking that.
Okay, you're off the hook. I have a question here from Mark Headley. He's wondering what is a good book or some resources in this area in regards to history that you can share with people.
I would suggest probably right off the bat would be maybe Will Bagley's book, South Pass. It is probably the best overview for the area, but it focuses primarily on the trail and on South Pass itself, not so much on the desert.
Thank you. And if folks have any questions, please just begin to populate those in the chat box, and I will do my best to choose which ones to ask Todd. There was a nice question by Chris Floyd, and I think you really already answered this, but if you had any further thoughts, I'd like to hear them. And he says, the Red Desert has been used for spiritual, political, and economic purposes for generations. Is there a new vision for the desert in terms of how it is used or protected? How can it be part of a new economy for Wyoming, or can it?
Well, I think that's an accurate statement, that it's been an economic hub, a spiritual hub. I mean, it's been central to many people's lives, not just for generations, but for 12 or 15,000 years, for a very long time. And, you know, even if we put out, like if we ruin the desert by putting out big wind farms and solar panels, that's still an economic aspect, like having buffalo jumps or, you know, antelope traps and everything else that's been done out there over the centuries to provide an income, provide a living, provide food for people. And you know, the technology that we use might change, but everything that could be done, you know, it's economic, it's religious, it's everything, and always has been and always will be, as long as there are people who go out there.
I'd like to throw in my 2 cents for the citizens of the Red Desert group. We are actually right now, Chris and others, formulating a vision for the Red Desert. And the way that we are thinking about a vision is what we would like our great-grandchildren or grandchildren to experience in this landscape. And this historical piece is, as Todd has said, is important to us and our vision. And we would really like that to be, you know, really protected and shared in a way that folks can come to the desert and still find their place in history and why we are here. Let me go to a few other questions. A lot of thank yous, Todd, I'm getting from folks. There was a question about Jefferson. Linda Hilo asked, was Jefferson concerned about the British folks to the north, the Hudson Bay Company?
Yes, in a word, because they encroached down into the Louisiana territory that we had just purchased. They were in Montana and Idaho and clear down here in Wyoming, trying to make nice with all of the Indian tribes in this area. And Jefferson and all the rest of them viewed the Hudson's Bay Company as a sort of a semi-official arm of the British government and as a threat to our development.
All right, any other questions? There's 108 people on. I'm sure you have a question. Don't be afraid to type it in the chat box. I have a question, if I may. I have heard stories from friends from the Red Desert, or excuse me, from the Wind River Indian Reservation, and from John Myazinski, that the Eastern Shoshone people worked with the United States Cavalry and some of the forts there to allow that westward expansion. Can you expand on the tribal involvement with the US government, and what tribes played in what roles there?
Yeah, so there had been Numic, a language family, or Shoshonean people in this area for several thousand years. The Eastern Shoshones, we think based on the old traditions and the archaeological evidence, came through South Pass from the Great Basin, came through South Pass about 500 or 600 years ago, and were the dominant force. They came with the Comanches, who were related, very closely related, it's almost the same people. And the Comanches came through South Pass and then turned south and became the dominant political military force on the southern plains. And the Shoshones were the dominant political military force from basically the Platte all the way north to the Canadian border. But because of disease that was brought in by white people and changing climate and environment and things, the Shoshone tribe suffered severe loss of population at the same time that the Sioux and Arapaho and Cheyenne were getting guns from the traders back in Minnesota and places like that, and began to try and displace the Shoshones. And it all came to a point, or a heated boiling point, in June of 1861, a month after the Civil War started back east. And the Sioux, under Crazy Horse and his brother Little Hawk and several other prominent warriors, attacked Washaki's Shoshone village right at the last crossing of Sweetwater that we call Burnt Ranch today. And they captured every single Shoshone horse. And they killed many of the Shoshone warriors. And then before the Shoshones under Washakie could counterattack, and got, we think, about half of their horses back. And I got this story first from some older Shoshone ladies who came up to visit me at South Pass every month or two. And then some friends at Pine Ridge told me the same story that had been told to them by their grandfathers and grandmothers. And I thought, this is really important to both of these tribes. Why isn't it in any of the history books? And that question I can't answer. But the result of that battle was that the Shoshones under Washakie had to retreat back to Salt Lake City and were dependent on Brigham Young and the Mormons for a year or two to survive. And then they signed that first Fort Bridger Treaty in 1863 to get soldiers out here, to get this area declared a Shoshone reservation and make it legally, by United States government terms, legally Shoshone country. And that's why why Washakie allied himself so tightly with the United States government and the United States Army, is because the Siouan tribes had basically said, we're either going to drive you back into the Great Basin where you came from 500 years ago, or we're going to kill you where you stand. And so there was this horrific conflict right there, and Washakie made a deal with the devil, and never dreaming that there'd be so many white people and they'd have so much military power that the bison would all be slaughtered and he would be confined to the reservation. It was a pragmatic survival choice that he had. What's the lesser of two enemies, basically.
Wow, that's interesting. Quite complex too. I think we have time for one more question, and there's a question in the chat box from Steph, and she has said, I've heard that Cortez came as far north as is the Red Desert. Is there any possible truth to this?
There's possible truth, but no proof, no solid evidence.
And also, I have a message from Tom Christensen, who's sharing some of your publications. He has a couple articles that can be found in the winter of 1999 to 2000 and 2003 to 2003 issues of Overland Journal, Quarterly Journal of the Oregon California Trails Association. So if folks are looking to read more from Todd. And And Todd, would it be okay if I shared folks your email so they could follow up with other questions that come to mind after this presentation?
Sure.
Thank you.
But realize we're in the last couple weeks of the semester, so I might not be able to answer immediately because everything's crazy getting ready for finals and final exams. And now it's good everybody's microphones are muted because my students are all starting to weep and gnash their teeth. But yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Todd. I want to let everybody know that this again this has been recorded, and I will be sharing this through our social media channels, and it'll be up on the website. And a couple of folks have asked about tours. I encourage you to go to reddesert.org and get on our mailing list. We will be having several tours there this summer with experts like Todd, Jason Valdez, John Mayazinski, Yufna Soldier Wolf, and others. So please be a part of our group. And if folks are interested about really being part of the vision, the next vision for this landscape, please also join us. And thank you so much for coming today, everybody. And thank you, Todd. Any last words, Todd?
Thank you all very much. I love a chance to talk. It's the family curse.
Hey, Todd, this is Elizabeth. Just wanted to say hi.
Hi, E.T. Good to see your name.
Yep.
Hear your voice.
Here. And I left you a couple messages in the chat if you've got a minute.
I'll take a look.
Thanks.
And please, I'd like to mention that we have a Red Desert driving tour map. If people want a copy of that, they should go to reddesert.org and ask for it, and we'll put one in the mail to you. But that's a great way for people to explore this landscape on a pretty good route that we've already scouted out with some fairly good roads.
Awesome, everyone. Thank you again. And please stay tuned for next month's series on Native American history with Yufna Soldier Wolf and some of our partners there. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.